that President Biden and President Xi agreed on in their meeting, and ask their colleagues and staff to follow up on. And I see definite good prospects for cooperation on these matters.
The U.S. Treasury is perilously close to being unable to fulfill its obligations to the federal government due to a lack of funds. This precarious situation was predicted by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen almost a month and a half ago, and particularly in November 2020 when she called on Congress to take prompt action to prevent the U.S. from descending into a situation of debt default, which would be catastrophic. This predicament has been exacerbated by the rapid increase in the U.S.'s debt and its associated service costs, which have been aggravated by the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates by more than 4% this year. If the two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, who together constitute the majority of the Senate and House of Representatives respectively, fail to arrive at an agreement on how to proceed, the U.S. government would be left with few options for meeting its commitments. These would include the possibility of taking out more loans, reducing expenditure on essential services such as healthcare, or even liquidating the country's gold reserves. All of these measures come with their own drawbacks, however, and the most imperious question remains: how can the U.S. settle its debts while it is dependent on the dollar, a currency it prints itself? This and other queries will be addressed in today's episode. The U.S. government borrows money through the selling of bonds by the Treasury Department, which then pays interest on the debt. This process helps to cover budget deficits and raises the U.S. debt, bringing it ever closer to the debt ceiling established by Congress. This limit on government borrowing was enacted in 1917 with the passage of the Second Liberty Bond Act, which gave the U.S. the right to issue bonds without congressional authorization as long as the total value did not exceed $11.5 billion. Later, the U.S. Congress put a cap on the total U.S. debt in 1939, setting it at $45 billion. This debt ceiling has been raised multiple times since then, most recently in 2021 when it was increased from $28.9 trillion to $31.4 trillion. Whenever the debt approaches this limit, the government must obtain congressional approval to raise it. This is necessary to ensure that the government has enough money to support its activities and pay its debts. The debt ceiling serves as a reminder to both the government and the public that borrowing should be regulated. Before the end of the year, the U.S. Treasury Department has expressed its desire to raise the debt ceiling once again. In November, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was in India and warned Reuters that if Congress does not promptly lift the debt ceiling, it could pose a grave threat to the U.S. credit rating and financial markets. Someone may think she's crazy. The U.S. government's debt has already surpassed $31 trillion for the first time in history and is now at $31.4 trillion, with only $98 billion left for essential expenditures. Therefore, Congress must approve a raise in the debt ceiling as soon as possible. As of now, Congress has yet to raise the debt ceiling, but it is expected to do so in the first quarter of 2023. Nonetheless, if Congress denies to raise the debt ceiling, what will happen? How will the U.S. government be affected, and what will be the repercussion to the economy? To explain why the U.S. has surpassed the debt ceiling, there are two major factors. Firstly, the government's huge spending of $6.27 trillion in 2022. Secondly, and most notably, the escalating cost linked to servicing the debt. The U.S. government pays interest on the debt, and this is known as the debt service. As the Federal Reserve has steadily raised interest rates to 4.2%, the Treasury Department has had to pay more money to service the debt. On December 12th, the U.S. Treasury Department reported that it had paid $180 billion and $3 billion in public interest expenses in October and November 2022 alone, which is 87% more than the same period last year. These funds must come from somewhere, so the Treasury Department has had to borrow them from the market, leading to increased public interest. This brings the department back to Congress to ask for an increase in the debt ceiling. If Congress fails to do so, there are no alternatives. The U.S. government can only implement a series of gradual steps until Congress consents to raise the debt ceiling. Initially, once the general budget reaches the debt ceiling, the Treasury Department can take out additional funds through extraordinary measures or special measures to conserve some money. For instance, the ministry was able to purchase bonds from the accounts of federal employee pensions before the interest was due. This enabled the ministry to acquire money from its friends. The U.S. government found itself in debt, and so it sought to control spending by suspending contributions to some government pensioners and relying on private funds to manage currency fluctuations. This was not the first time the U.S. Treasury had used such special measures. They had been employed at least 16 times since 1985. This was simply a stopgap measure to buy time until Congress showed generosity and raised the debt ceiling, so the government could borrow more. Nevertheless, the money was soon gone, but Congress had yet to act. As a result, the U.S. government had to search through its pockets for anything that could be used, like gold reserves in Egypt. This had occurred before. In 1939, the debt ceiling law was passed and the U.S. government complied for about 14 years, during which the ceiling was raised more than once. In 1953, the U.S. debt hit the debt ceiling, which was then set at $275 billion. Congress refused to raise the debt ceiling, despite the government's requests. And so U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower asked all federal agencies to immediately decrease their expenses. This was not enough, so the U.S. government resorted to using some of its gold reserves. In November 1953, the U.S. had only $25 million left, and the debt ceiling, previously at $275 billion, had to be reached. The U.S. Secretary of Treasury at the time, George Henry, took $500 million of the free gold not bound by any legal requirements that the U.S. Treasury kept in reserve above the legal requirements, and used it to purchase part of the government's debt.
Our borrowing costs would increase, and every American would see that their borrowing costs would increase as well. On top of that, a failure to make